Welcome to U.S. Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Russia fires barrage of missiles across Ukraine, poor facial recognition in New Orleans, your weekly non-Beltway stories, why the Israel-Gaza war is so politically dicey for Biden, John Fetterman unleashed, I've already been dead once, pause, ceasefire? Senator Peter Welch doesn't see a difference. Russia fires barrage of missiles across Ukraine, Financial Times. Russia has launched a series of aerial attacks on Ukraine, targeting multiple regions across the country. The strikes included Iranian-made Shahed drones and missiles, with more than half of the drones being shot down. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that Russian forces would continue to cause harm as winter approaches, and called for continued international support. Zelensky's administration has repeatedly called for additional air defenses and offensive weaponry from the US and other Western allies. However, concerns are growing that support for Ukraine could be jeopardized, particularly as attention has shifted to other conflicts and there are doubts about the approval of a new assistance package from U.S. lawmakers. Poor facial recognition in New Orleans. Your weekly non-Beltway stories. Washington Post. The U.S. city of New Orleans has been criticized for its facial recognition technology, which has failed to identify suspects in a majority of cases. The police department in the city began using the technology in 2022. And although it has not led to any false arrests, it does amplify the biases of the authorities that use it, according to an investigation by Politico. The U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention has reported a 3% increase in the country's infant mortality rate, the highest rise in 2 decades. Meanwhile, Minnesota has opened 3/4 of state jobs to people who do not hold a 4-year college degree. Why the Israel-Gaza war is so politically dicey for Biden. Washington Post. President Biden's support for Israel during the recent conflict with Gaza has caused dissatisfaction among some key voter groups within the Democratic base, according to recent polling. While Republicans overwhelmingly approve of Biden's handling of the situation, Democrats are more divided, particularly among Black and Hispanic voters. The polls also show that independent candidates Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Cornel West have gained support, with 1/4 of respondents backing them. If this dissatisfaction continues, it could pose a risk to Biden's re-election campaign in 2024. John Fetterman unleashed, I've already been dead once. Washington Post. John Fetterman, the Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, has begun to take controversial policy stances and publicly criticize his colleagues, leading some to question his behavior. Fetterman has been vocal in his support of Israel's right to attack Hamas in Gaza, which has put him at odds with many liberals back home who are calling for a ceasefire. Fetterman has also been publicly heckling Senator Bob Menendez, who is facing federal indictments for bribery and other crimes. Some of Fetterman's colleagues have publicly rebuked him for his behavior and stances, but Fetterman dismisses the criticism, saying that he has already been through worse. Pause? Ceasefire? Senator Peter Welch doesn't see a difference. Washington Post. Senator Peter Welch, Democrat Vermont, has said that he sees no difference between a pause and a ceasefire in Gaza. At this point I don't. The bottom line is that if we're going to save civilians and get sustainable humanitarian relief in, they've got to stop dropping the bombs. The terminology here is secondary. The mission is save civilian lives. You can't have effective delivery of humanitarian relief when everybody who's doing that work is in the line of fire, Welch told the Washington Post. The conversation has been edited and condensed for length and clarity. The early, do you believe it's time for a ceasefire? Welch, we're getting into a debate about the terminology when civilians are dying and a dire situation's going to get catastrophically worse. All of us are outraged at what Hamas did, and anytime Israel can attack a Hamas militant without civilian casualties, we would support that. But when, in the name of getting a Hamas terrorist, you bomb a civilian area, a refugee camp, and there are scores and scores of civilian casualties, that's not right. The early, whether you describe it as a pause or a ceasefire, what would it look like? Welch, at a minimum it would have to last long enough for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, the folks on the ground that are setting up these systems, to be able to get them in place to provide, on a sustained and reliable basis, access to the food, the water, the sanitation, the medical care that Palestinians need. The early, what would you like to see Biden do to step up the pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Welch, I want him to be talking to Netanyahu every day and telling him that the war plan has to be designed to protect civilian life, innocent Palestinian life. The early, how long do you think a pause needs to last? Welch, however long it takes to set in place the aid, distribution systems and the delivery systems. I take the advice of the people on the ground. How long would that take? I don't know, but they would. And we're a long way from having that system in place. In fact, we're getting to a point where, unless there is a good aid system, we're going to start losing more people to starvation and disease than from the bombing. Your letter didn't mention the West Bank, where Jewish settlers have displaced hundreds of Palestinians since October 7. What do you want to see Biden doing with regard to the West Bank and Israeli settlements there? Welch, telling Netanyahu in no uncertain terms that there's got to be accountability for those radical settlers who are attacking Palestinians in the West Bank. The Israeli government has to prosecute, it has to hold accountable, the settlers in the West Bank who are threatening and injuring and, in some cases, killing innocent Palestinians. U.S. backs JetBlue as it fights expulsion from Amsterdam airport. Bloomberg. The U.S. Department of Transportation has supported JetBlue Airways' attempt to fight its expulsion from Amsterdam's Schiphol airport, calling the Dutch move unjustifiable and unreasonable. The department has approved formal complaints by JetBlue and industry group Airlines for America, and talks between the DOT, the Dutch government, and the European Commission are set for November 13. JetBlue has asked the DOT to evict KLM from New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport in response to its expulsion from Schiphol. Trump Jr. tells court artist "Make me look sexy," points to fake SBF sketch. Washington Post. Donald Trump Jr. has been accused of asking a sketch artist to make him look sexy during a civil fraud trial. Trump Jr. approached the artist, Jane Rosenberg, after giving testimony in a case against his family's business. He showed her a fake courtroom sketch of Sam Bankman-Fried, who was convicted of fraud, conspiracy and money laundering, and asked if he could be portrayed in a flattering way. Rosenberg, who has previously drawn sketches of Harvey Weinstein and Tom Brady, rejected the request. Trump Jr. later confirmed he asked the artist to make him look good in his courtroom image. The trial is examining accusations that Trump Organization inflated financial statements to secure better terms. The movement against Israel's bombing of Gaza is bottom-up leadership. Washington Post opinion. A national movement has emerged in the U.S. to criticize the Israeli government's bombing of Gaza and urge the Biden administration to stop offering unqualified support to Israel. While there have been some anti-Semitic comments made by some involved in the movement, overall their activism has been positive and has caused increased skepticism about Israel's military offensive. Protests have taken place across the country, including at college campuses, and this Saturday a mass protest is scheduled to take place in Washington, D.C. The movement is not just limited to marches and protests. Hundreds of Jewish and Muslim Capitol Hill staffers have signed a letter calling for a ceasefire. Former staff to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have put their names on letters calling for an end to the bombing, and Jewish writers, artists, and activists have written a letter calling for a ceasefire and disavowing the idea that criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. The movement is diverse, with Jewish activists and organizations involved, including Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, as well as Black and other people of color. While the movement has not yet achieved its main goal of stopping Israel's bombing in Gaza, it has forced a national debate about U.S. Israeli-Palestinian policies. Ladies and gentlemen, I am the Sixth Doctor, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world. Let's dive into the news. In Russia, things are heating up as they launch a series of aerial attacks on Ukraine. President Zelensky is calling for international support, but there are concerns that this assistance might be in jeopardy. It seems attention has shifted elsewhere, and doubts surround the approval of a new assistance package from U.S. lawmakers. It's a sticky situation, folks. Moving on to New Orleans, their facial recognition technology is under fire for its poor performance. It's failing to identify suspects in a majority of cases, and while it hasn't led to any false arrests, it does amplify the biases of the authorities using it. Not a great look, New Orleans. And in U.S. politics, President Biden's support for Israel during the recent conflict with Gaza is causing some dissatisfaction within his own Democratic base. Polls show that Black and Hispanic voters are divided on the issue, and independent candidates are gaining support. Could this pose a risk to Biden's re-election campaign in 2024? Only time will tell. Speaking of politicians causing a stir, Democratic Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania is ruffling feathers with his controversial policy stances and public criticisms. He's been vocal in his support of Israel's actions in Gaza, which has put him at odds with many liberals back home. Some of his colleagues have rebuked him, but Fetterman dismisses the criticism, claiming he's been through worse. Oh, Fetterman, you rebel. Meanwhile, Senator Peter Welch doesn't see a difference between a pause and a ceasefire in Gaza. He believes the priority should be saving civilian lives and providing humanitarian relief. He's calling for President Biden to step up the pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and ensure accountability for radical settlers in the West Bank. Welch is all about action and results. In other news, JetBlue Airways is fighting its expulsion from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport with the support of the U.S. Department of Transportation. They're calling the Dutch move unjustifiable and unreasonable. Talk about a high-flying battle. And let's not forget Donald Trump Jr.'s courtroom antics during a civil fraud trial. He asked a sketch artist to make him look sexy and pointed to a fake sketch of someone else as a reference. Sorry, Don Jr., but courtrooms aren't the place for a fashion show. Lastly, a movement against Israel's bombing of Gaza has emerged in the U.S. While there have been some anti-Semitic comments, overall, the activism has caused increased skepticism about Israel's military offensive. Protests, letters, and calls for a ceasefire are gaining momentum, forcing a national debate about U.S.-Israeli-Palestinian policies. It's a diverse movement with Jewish activists, organizations, and people of color involved. Change is in the air. And that's a wrap for today's news, folks. Remember, your thoughts and opinions matter too. So, what do you think about these stories? Share your ideas and questions, and let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the 6 Degrees world. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.